Welcome back to the engine rebuilding series for the late model KTM and Husqvarna 450, 500, and 501 dirt bike engines. Now, in this video, we're going to be assembling our bottom end, but if you need to know how to get to this point, go back and watch the other videos. So with that being said, let's get started. Everybody's parts list will look a little bit different, but typical things that you might need are some bottom end gaskets. We have our top end gasket kit, a replacement piston. You might need a replacement crankshaft or connecting rod kit. And we also have a little bit of gasket maker and the Tusk oil change kit along with some coolant. To do this job, we're going to need a combination of common hand tools and specialty tools. So real quick, the specialty stuff that you can't get by without, I'm going to show you right now. So we've got our gear jammer and an M6 by 40 millimeter bolt. Now there is a special tool you can use instead of this, but this is going to work just fine. Now, other than that, we have a couple of pliers that are a little different. So we've got these locking pliers that are going to help us tighten down our clutch hub nut. But if you don't want to use these, you can buy a special tool for that. We're also using snap ring pliers, a flywheel holder, and then other than that, most of this is just common hand tools. So, you know, we're going to be using stuff like safety glasses, rubber gloves, some rags, contact cleaner, this blue Loctite. If you're replacing your bearings, you're going to need a bearing driver kit. We've got our sockets and torque wrench, along with some Allen keys, screwdrivers, and a pick. So we're going to start with our right side engine case in the engine stand, and we've got it tipped a little bit. You can put it level if that's easier for you. And we're going to lube up our bearings. Then we're going to take our crank, got a little assembly lube on that inner ace for the main bearing. We're going to slide this into place, but look out for that washer right there. You don't want to damage it. When you put this in, you might have to turn it just a little bit to get it started. There we go. Now we're going to install the transmission shafts as a set. We've got that washer and gear that can come off. So to prevent that, we put a rubber band around one side, and then as you slide it in, these gears in the middle, these 3/4 gears, they're held on by circlips. So if you need to hang off of those to keep your fingers out of the way, you can go ahead and do that. Okay, so before that gets too far in, I'm going to remove the rubber band. All right, next we have our shift forks. So the two that are going to go in our counter shaft, they're pretty similar in appearance, but if you look where the middle of that fork goes, you know, you can see this one, we have less of a shoulder to the top. The one that goes on the bottom has more of a shoulder right there. So this one is going to be in the bottom. And we've got our main shaft fork. And the shift drum. Then I'm lining up these pins with that shift drum. And we've got that upper shift fork last. Then we got the shift fork shafts. We'll slide those into place. Make sure they're lubed up as well. And just to make sure this shifts through all the gears, I'm going to go through the shift drum's full range of motion while I turn that counter shaft. So we know we're good. Now for the other case half, we do need to lube up the bearings, but we don't want oil dripping on the sealant we're going to put on this case half. So I'm just going to put some grease on these bearings. Then on the other side, we have these oil seals. We're going to grease those lips as well. Next, we're going to apply our sealant to the case half. We have our dowel pin in place. We've got that other dowel pin on the other case half. Take one more glance at the right case half, make sure there's no oil that dripped down onto the surface, and we're going to install that left case half. Now we're going to line up the case and set it in place. And once you get to where this is almost all the way on, you might have to use a mallet to finish tapping it on. There is no special tool to finish pressing this together. You're going to have to use a soft face mallet. And from here, we're going to torque down all of the case half bolts in a crisscross pattern to 7.4 foot-pounds. Now we're going to install our freewheeling gear on that other side. And after that, we're going to install our primary gear. Now with that, I'm going to make sure the taper is clean. I don't want any oil on there. And you also need to make sure the woodruff key is in place. And we're just going to lightly tap that in with our punch. And I'm actually using a little contact cleaner on a rag to clean up the taper. And we'll do the same thing on the gear. And the last thing we'll do before we install it is apply just a little bit of assembly lube to that one-way clutch. And to get that into place, you're going to have to rotate that freewheeling gear and make sure you have that groove on the primary gear lined up with the woodruff key. Now we're going to move over to the shifting mechanism. If you had your locating arm off, you're going to want to get that reinstalled and torque that bolt to 4.4 foot-pounds with some blue Loctite. Next, we're going to install the star wheel onto the shift drum. You'll notice that these little flat sections, they're not even, so make sure you get that lined up correctly. And the locating arm, I'm just pushing that out of the way with a screwdriver for now. And then for the mounting bolt, I'm applying some blue Loctite to it. And we're going to torque it to 7.4 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install the shift shaft. Make sure you have this washer in place. And then I've applied a little bit of lube where the shaft rides on those bearings. And then we have that sliding plate. I'm just going to push down on the button to get it out of the way. Push that through the seal on the other side. And one other thing you'll notice that we have that spring lined up on both sides of that tab. Now we're going to install the shift lever on the other side and then shift through all the gears just to make sure we did everything correctly. Now we're going to start getting our oil pumps assembled. So I'm going to apply some assembly lube to that shaft and we'll slide it through from the left side of the engine. Now we're going to install our pin for that rotor. Now we're going to install the rotor. Now the manual talks about a recess and a bevel, but really, you know, this outer one, both sides look the same. This one side just has a dot on it, and this clearly can only be installed one way. This has the dot, so we're just going to make both the dots face inward. And I'm pressing out on the shaft just a little bit so it doesn't fall out. Then we're going to install both of these bolts to 7.4 foot-pounds with some blue Loctite. Next we have another pin, and we're going to install these oil pump drive gears. Make sure you match up the slot with the pin. And we've got a washer, and the sharp edge of the E-clip I'm having face outward. Just make sure that clip is fully installed. Then we'll install this larger gear with that collar facing inward. We also have some assembly lube on that bushing. And we've got a washer and a circlip on the end. And again, all these circlips, we're having the sharp edge facing out. After that, we're going to install the circlip for the transmission. Next, we're going to install the starter intermediate gear and the torque limiter gear. So I'm going to apply assembly lube to those surfaces. Now, the intermediate gear has a bevel on these teeth. So that bevel is going to go towards the case. Just rotate it until it engages those teeth. The torque limiter bolt is torqued to 7.4 foot-pounds, and we're using some blue Loctite. After that, we're going to install our collar and the needle bearings for the clutch. After that, we're going to install the clutch basket. You might have to rotate it to get everything lined up. Then we're going to install our washer and the inner clutch hub. And the clutch nut. And then we're going to install the primary drive gear nut. And this one we're going to use a little bit of Loctite on. And remember, it's going to be lefty tighty, righty loosey. Now, primary gear nut, that gets torqued to 73.8 foot-pounds. And if any extra Loctite came out, make sure you get that wiped up. Now on the other side, if you don't have the special clutch holding tool, what you're going to have to do is get that O-ring installed. We have this collar. Put that into place. Then install your sprocket. We've got this new shaft, we're going to have to pull that off. We're just going to temporarily install this sprocket and tighten the bolt. I'm going to use these vice grips on that countershaft sprocket. We'll flip the motor around and torque our bolt. When we torque the bolt, these are going to hit this engine stand mount and help hold everything in place. And we're going to torque the nut to 59 foot-pounds. After that, you want to bend at least one of these locking tabs on the lock washer down. So we're just using some channel locks to do that. But on our bike, just to be safe, we're going to use both of these tabs. Next, we've got some pins for that clutch hub. We're going to put those in. We've got lube on them. Then we can start installing the clutch plates. Make sure you have oil on all of these as they go together. I'm just going to hook that bottom one first. And slide the plate into place. Now this plate is the one that has the S on it. And we're just going to alternate between frictions and stills. After that, we have our throw out, and then our pressure plate. Next, we're going to install this pre-tension ring. And you'll see a little mark in it. This says top. At least I think it says top. There's a mark in it though. Next, we'll install the spring washer and spring retainer. And this can be positioned in a few different spots. We're going to use the number 1 position. And we're going to torque these bolts to 4.4 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. We're also using a gear jammer to hold everything secure. Now that we have all the bolts torqued down, we're going to check the spring washer for distortion. We're just going to use a straight edge almost as far as we can go towards that spring retainer. And we're supposed to have 0.1 millimeters of clearance, which we do. If you don't, if that's not in spec, then you want to rotate this to the number 2 position, recheck it, and if it's still not in spec, you can go to number 3, and if it's still not in spec, that's when you're going to be replacing the clutch plates. On the clutch cover, we need to time the balancer shaft. So we have this dot on this end of this gear, and that needs to line up with this hole in the cover right there. There is a special tool to align that, but this video is for the average at-home mechanic. So what we're going to do is just use a longer bolt, thread it all the way in until it lines up with the gap in those gears. So we've just threaded that in by hand. The gear's not going anywhere. And I just want to point out, you're not damaging anything by doing this. We threaded it in by hand, and there's still play in between this. So we're going to go ahead and make sure we have our dowel pins on our case half, and then install the clutch cover gasket. So we've got the balancer in the right position. We need to make sure the crankshaft is in the right position. So the connecting rod, it needs to be at its highest point. So with that, you can see on the crank web down in this hole right here, there's a little notch when it's at the highest point. And there's actually a special tool that we can set down in there to make sure it doesn't move. But again, this is for the average at-home guy. So if you see that notch and you want to make sure it's completely centered, what you can do is this bolt that goes through that right side cover or clutch cover, you can remove that copper washer, thread the bolt in, and make sure it lines up with your crank web and that the web doesn't move. But then you're going to have to pull this bolt back out. So we can't move right there. We're lined up perfectly. We just need to make sure we don't move anything, and we'll verify that as soon as we get the cover on as well. We've got some fresh oil on our seal, and we'll set the cover down into place. So if I look down in there, you know, that notch is still lined up. So we know we're good. And we can go ahead and install the bolts into this cover. We're also going to be installing this outer clutch cover as well. This is where you hope you kept track of the correct sizes or the correct bolts in the correct positions. Clearly we did not. So we're going to have to move these around until we find the right spots. Then we'll install the O-ring for the outer cover. All right, now we can remove our special tool. And at this point, I'm also going to install this water pump cover. Make sure those two pins are in the correct spots. Make sure the bolt with the crush washer goes here. Then we can go ahead and tighten everything down in a crisscross pattern to 7.4 foot-pounds. And by the way, if you didn't see this when it was going in, this has some blue Loctite on it. Next, we're going to install our gear position sensor, and we're using some blue Loctite on those bolts or screws. Now we're going to install the oil pump or suction pump on the other side. And I don't have my crank locked at top dead center. I wanted to put this shaft so that slot is level, and that way it can hold this pin while I install these rotors. Now again, with the rotors, we have those dots, and those are going to face inside toward the case. And then we're using new bolts. They already have Loctite on them, but if you're reusing the old ones, make sure you put some Loctite on there. Next, we're going to install our cam chain. Now with this, if you're reusing your old cam chain, then you want to make sure it's in the same orientation as when you took it off. That's what we're doing since we only have a few hours on our motor, and we're just swapping out some transmission gears. But if you're in your bottom end and you've got a lot of hours on your bike, typically you'll be replacing that chain with a new one. Then after that, we're going to install the cam chain guide rails. So we've got a groove that this sits in, and it also hooks in at the top of the case. Got this clip at the bottom. And the right side guide just bolts right into place. We're going to tighten those bolts down to 7.4 foot-pounds. I'm going to install my dowel pin for the crankshaft. Once you have the Woodruff key installed, you want to clean the taper off on the crankshaft as well as the taper on the flywheel. Now that we've got it cleaned up, we'll line up the flywheel with our Woodruff key. We'll get that installed and torque the nut to 44.3 foot-pounds. The manual wants us to have some engine oil on these threads. And we're just going to install our flywheel holding tool to do that. Next, we're going to remove our tool. And one little note with this is, we made sure our flywheel didn't move, but if it just does start to move, be real careful because you don't want this cam chain to bind. So it may be helpful to pull up on the chain or have somebody do that while you torque this down. Now we're going to install the gasket. And right by this rubber piece for the flywheel cover, we're going to apply just a little bit of sealant right there on the corners. And you can also put it behind that rubber piece to make sure that seals completely against this cover. All right, with this, you're going to want to watch your fingers. You can cut the ends off of some bolts and thread those in to help guide this into place. But I'm just going to line it up ahead of time and guide it into place, and my fingers are only on the sides, and it's going to suck it on just like that. I didn't even mean to put it on, but there you go. Don't forget the bolt for the cover with the washer on it goes on top right there. And we'll install the rest of the bolts. And as always, they're going to be torqued to 7.4 foot-pounds. After that, we can install our oil filter. Now we're going to install our oil filter cover. Again, these bolts are going to get torqued to 7.4 foot-pounds. Moving on to the oil screens, we'll start with the short one. This one goes on bottom, and the oil screen bolts are going to get torqued to 11.1 foot-pounds. Followed by the drain bolt, and this one's 14.8 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to install the starter motor, and we've also applied just a little bit of grease to that O-ring. Now for the push rod, we're going to wait to install this until we have the engine back into the frame. And that's it for the bottom end assembly on the late model KTM and Husqvarna 450s, 500s, and 501s. If you need to know how to get your top end assembled, follow us over to the next video in our engine rebuild series. Now, if you need any parts for your rebuild, check out our website. We have a lot of different options on there for you, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more helpful content. Thanks for watching.